I stood at the entrance of my eldest son's wedding venue, clutching the USB drive that would destroy everything they'd built on my bones. The champagne tower glittered like their lies. My hands didn't shake anymore. At 72 years old, my hands told stories no one bothered to read anymore, careless palms that had scrubbed their childhood messes, needed dough for countless forgotten birthdays, held them through nightmares they no longer remembered. Each wrinkle was a treaty signed in silence, a compromise made in the shadows, a piece of myself traded for their comfort that was never reciprocated. The arthritis that gnawed my fingers wasn't just age, it was the physical manifestation of holding on too tight to people who'd already let go. I had become a master architect of my own isolation, building walls brick by invisible brick, each one laid with a phone call they didn't return, a holiday invitation they declined, a grandchild's birthday they forgot I existed for. My personality wasn't quiet by nature, it was excavated, hollowed out, scraped clean by years of speaking into voids, of my words evaporating before they reached anyone's ears. I had learned to swallow my voice until silence became my native language, until I forgot what it felt like to be heard. The abandonment wasn't cinematic, no dramatic door slamming, no tearful airport scenes, no final devastating argument I could point to and say, that's when it ended. Instead, it was insidious, a slow-motion drowning where the water level rose so gradually I didn't notice I couldn't breathe until I was completely submerged. It started with, "I'll call you back, Mom," that never came, escalated to, "We're just so busy," that became their permanent excuse, and culminated in 5 years of existing as a ghost in my own family, my name mentioned only when they needed to justify draining my accounts to their accountants. Before I continue my story, I'd like to know who's on the other side listening to me. Comment your name and where you're watching from. And check if you're already subscribed to the channel, it helps me so much to keep bringing these real stories to you. Write in the comments where you're watching this video from, we love knowing how far our stories are reaching. But let me take you back to where this truly began, back when I still believed in the goodness of my children, back when I didn't know that love could be commodified and sold to the highest bidder. 6 years ago, my husband Robert died suddenly of a heart attack. We'd been married for 47 years. He went to bed complaining of indigestion and never woke up. The funeral was elaborate, expensive, everything Robert would have hated. My 3 children, Michael, Patricia, and James, organized everything, which I initially thought was thoughtful. They dressed in designer black, dabbed at dry eyes with monogrammed handkerchiefs, and played the devastated children for an audience of Robert's business associates and our dwindling circle of elderly friends who still remembered us. Michael, my eldest at 49, had always been the golden child, Stanford-educated, corporate executive, married to Vanessa who wore her wealth like armor. He gave the eulogy with the practiced emotion of someone who'd rehearsed in front of a mirror, his voice cracking at calculated moments while his eyes remained cold and assessing, always assessing, like a jeweler appraising stones. Patricia, 46, was my only daughter, and perhaps that's why her betrayal cut deepest. She'd been my confidant once, or so I thought. We'd baked together, shared secrets, braided each other's hair. But somewhere between her second divorce and her lifestyle blog that hemorrhaged money faster than she could post filtered photos, that girl disappeared and was replaced by a stranger who looked at me with thinly veiled contempt. James, the baby at 43, had always been troubled, gambling debts, failed business ventures, a cocaine habit he thought he hid well. Robert had bailed him out more times than I could count. At the funeral, James couldn't even look at me, his guilt already eating at him for what they were planning, though I didn't know it yet. After the funeral, they gathered in my living room, the house where I'd raised them, where the walls still held their childhood laughter like pressed flowers in a book no one opened anymore. The mahogany coffee table Robert had built with his own hands stood between us, a silent witness to what came next. "Mom, we need to talk about finances," Michael began, sitting in Robert's favorite armchair like he already owned it. The leather creaked under his weight, a sound that used to signal Robert's arrival home from work. Now it announced the beginning of my systematic destruction. Patricia sat beside me on the couch, her hand covering mine in what anyone watching would call comfort but felt like a snake coiling around its prey. "Daddy left things complicated," she said, her voice dripping with that false sweetness she'd perfected for her Instagram followers. "The estate, the accounts, everything's tangled up. We are going to need to help you manage things." I should have seen it then, should have noticed how James wouldn't meet my eyes, how his hands trembled not from grief but from something else, shame, perhaps, or the last dying gasp of his conscience. You shouldn't have to worry about this stuff at your age, Ma, he mumbled, his words slurring slightly. Let us handle it. They spoke about me like I wasn't there, or worse, like I was already incompetent, a child who needed protecting from the complexity of adult decisions. The accounts need consolidating, power of attorney would simplify everything, at her age, these stresses aren't healthy. The words floated around me like poisonous gas, invisible but deadly. In my grief fog, I signed papers. So many papers. They appeared before me with sticky notes marking where my signature was needed, explanations rushed and technical, my children's faces arranged in expressions of concern that I now recognize as barely contained greed. Just here, Mom. This is standard. The lawyer said this protects you. What I actually signed was my own execution warrant. I gave them power of attorney, access to accounts I didn't fully understand, control over investments Robert had carefully built over decades. I trusted them because they were my children, because surely the people I'd nursed through fevers and nightmares wouldn't destroy me. I was catastrophically wrong. The first year after Robert died, I barely noticed the financial changes. I was drowning in grief, wandering through our big empty house like another ghost, talking to Robert's photo, sleeping in his shirts until his smell faded. My children visited occasionally, always rushed, always with some excuse about why they couldn't stay long. But slowly, subtly, my life began shrinking. The cleaning service I'd used for years called to say my payment hadn't gone through. Michael explained it away, just a banking error, Mom. I handle it. Then it was the lawn service, then the account at my usual grocery store, then my credit card declined at the pharmacy. We're transitioning your accounts, Patricia explained over the phone, never in person anymore. There's plenty of money, Mom, don't worry. Just use cash for now. We'll send you some. A few $100s would appear in an envelope, delivered by the assistant, like I was a beggar receiving alms from the church. My allowance, because that's what it was, though they never used that word, kept shrinking. First it was $2,000 a month, then $1,500, then $1,000, then $500. Meanwhile, I started seeing their lives explode into obscene luxury on social media, which I'd learned to use in my loneliness, desperately trying to stay connected to grandchildren who didn't know my voice. Michael bought a beach house in Malibu, posting photos of the sunset view from his infinity pool. Patricia launched her third failed business venture, some kind of wellness retreat that charged wealthy women $10,000 to do yoga and eat kale for a weekend. James bought a Maserati, bright red, the color of arterial blood. But I told myself stories to make it make sense. The estate was in probate. Things were complicated. Robert's investments needed time to mature. They were busy, successful people. They loved me. They wouldn't hurt me. The lies I told myself could have filled volumes. By the third year, I was barely surviving. The house, my house, the house Robert and I had bought in 1978, where we'd raised our children, where every room held memories, was deteriorating around me. The roof leaked but I couldn't afford repairs. The furnace died and I spent winter in one room with a space heater I'd found at a thrift store. My clothes came from donation bins now. My food came from church pantries and, when desperation clawed too hard, from the dumpsters behind grocery stores late at night. I'd wait until after midnight, hunched in my old coat, checking over my shoulder in case anyone I knew saw me, Eleanor Mitchell reduced to scavenging like a raccoon. The dumpster diving was an education in humiliation. The smell of rotting produce mixed with chemical cleaners burned my nostrils. The metal edges of the industrial bins left bruises on my ribs as I leaned in, stretching for packages of bread just past their sell-by date, dented cans, bruised fruit. My hands, which once wore Robert's modest but beautiful rings, were now cracked and bleeding from the cold and the rough metal. I'd bring my treasures home and wash them carefully in the kitchen sink, that beautiful farmhouse sink Robert installed himself, now stained and chipped because I couldn't afford the special cleaner it required. I'd sit at our dining table, the one we'd hosted Thanksgiving at for decades, and eat dented cans of soup cold because I was rationing propane. But here's what kept me up at night, what gnawed at my inside like a parasite. I knew Robert had left us comfortable. Not wealthy, but comfortable. He'd been a mechanical engineer, careful with money, invested wisely. We owned the house outright. There were insurance policies, retirement accounts, savings. Where had it gone? When I asked my children, their responses ranged from patronizing to hostile. "Mom, you're confused," Patricia would say, her voice sharp with irritation. "Dad's debts were more than you knew. Medical bills. Business losses. We're doing our best to keep you afloat." Michael would get angry. "Do you think I'm stealing from you? After everything I've done. This is the thanks I get." The gaslighting was expert level, making me doubt my own memories, my own understanding of our finances. Robert had always handled the money, they reminded me constantly. What did I really know about their situation? Maybe I was confused. Maybe grief had scrambled my brain. Maybe I was becoming the senile old woman they implied I was becoming. By the 4th year, I'd stopped asking. I'd stopped calling too, because their phones went to voicemail and voicemails went unreturned. I existed in a strange purgatory, not quite homeless but not quite housed, not quite starving but never quite full, not quite abandoned because technically I still had children, they just never came around. Christmas that year, I sat alone in my cold house, eating canned beans I'd fished from a dumpster behind a Save-A-Lot 3 days prior. My grandchildren, 7 of them now, were in Aspen with Michael and Vanessa, based on the Instagram photos Patricia shared. Patricia herself was in Dubai. James was in Vegas. And I was here, in the dark because I was saving electricity, wondering how my life had become so small. If I'm being honest, and I suppose there's no point in lying now, I thought about ending it that Christmas. The bottle of sleeping pills in my bathroom cabinet looked very appealing. Robert was gone. My children had discarded me. What was the point of continuing? The only thing that stopped me was spite, pure, burning spite. If I died, they'd win completely, they'd get whatever scraps were left without consequences. Spite kept me breathing. The 5th year, something shifted. Maybe it was hitting rock bottom. Maybe it was that spite crystallizing into something harder, sharper. I stopped accepting my fate and started questioning again. Where was the money? What exactly had I signed? What were my actual legal rights? I couldn't afford a lawyer, but the public library was free. I spent days there, grateful for the heat and the bathroom and the internet access, researching estate law, probate procedures, power of attorney limitations. The librarian, a kind woman named Susan who never asked why I came in every day wearing the same 3 outfits, helped me navigate legal databases. What I learned terrified and enraged me in equal measure. The power of attorney I'd signed gave them control, yes, but not ownership. They were supposed to be acting in my best interest, as fiduciaries. The estate should have been settled years ago. Something was very, very wrong, and I finally had enough anger to fuel my investigation. I started with the house. It was still in my name. I checked the county records online. So they hadn't stolen it outright, though Michael had mentioned several times that I should downsize to something more manageable, which I now understood meant something that would free up the equity for them to plunder. Then I requested documents from the bank, from the Social Security office, from Robert's former employer. It took months. The bureaucracy was Byzantine, designed to thwart someone without resources or energy. But I had nothing but time, and spite is an excellent motivator. Forms were filled out in the library, notarized at the bank where I'd held an account for 40 years, and they took pity on me. Slowly, painfully, the picture emerged. Robert had left me almost $2 million. Life insurance, retirement accounts, investments, savings. $2 million. And it was gone. Vanished. Transferred systematically over 5 years into my children's accounts, used to fund their increasingly lavish lifestyles while I ate from dumpsters. But I still didn't have proof of intent. They could claim they were managing my money, that the transfers were legitimate estate management, that they'd planned to take care of me. Without proof of malicious intent, I had nothing that would stand up in court. I needed evidence that they knew what they were doing, that it was deliberate theft, deliberate cruelty. The answer came from an unexpected place. Robert's old toolbox. He'd been a man who built things with his hands, who believed in the permanence of physical objects. His workshop in the garage had been untouched since his death. I couldn't bear to go through it, and my children had no interest in his tools, too busy spending his money to care about his legacy. One spring morning, the roof leak finally spread to the garage, water dripping onto Robert's workbench. I went out to move things, to salvage what I could, and found myself sitting on his old stool, surrounded by his tools, crying for the first time in months. Grief has no timeline, they say. It ambushes you in tool sheds on random Tuesday mornings. I started cleaning, organizing, a task to focus on besides my hunger and anger. His red metal toolbox sat on the bottom shelf, dented and paint-chipped from decades of use. I opened it to make sure no water had gotten in, and that's when I felt it, something loose in the bottom, shifting when I moved the box. A false bottom. Robert, careful Robert, had created a hidden compartment. My hands shook as I pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside were envelopes, letters, and something else, a small USB drive taped to the bottom. The letters were addressed to me, in Robert's distinctive handwriting, dated from the year before he died. Letters he'd never sent. Why had he hidden them? I sat on the cold garage floor and read them right there, unable to wait, unable to move. Each one was a knife twisting. Robert had known. He'd discovered what our children were planning, had overheard conversations, found documents. They'd been planning this before he died, discussing how to manage Mom once he was gone, how to access the money they felt entitled to. My dearest Eleanor, one letter began, and I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. I've discovered something that breaks my heart. Our children, our babies, have become strangers I don't recognize. They view us as assets to be liquidated rather than parents to be loved. I've been gathering evidence, trying to protect you, trying to understand how we raised such greed. There was more, so much more. Robert had been sick, had known his heart was failing long before that final night. He'd used his last months to document everything, to build a case, to protect me. The USB drive contained recordings, our children's voices, clear as day, discussing how they'd drained their accounts, how they'd convince me I was confused, how they'd isolate me. I sat in that garage until the light failed, listening to those recordings on an old laptop I'd borrowed from the library. My children's voices, laughing, planning, discussing me like I was already dead or might as well be. Mom won't know the difference, Patricia's voice said with casual cruelty. She barely understood money when Dad was alive. Michael's voice, cold and calculated, the key is to make her think she's losing her mind. Doctors will back a declaration of incompetence if we need it. At her age, who's going to question it? James, weak James, objecting briefly before being shouted down by his siblings. She's our mother, he said. Exactly, Michael responded. Which means she'd want us to have it. There was more, worse. Discussion of offshore accounts Robert had set up that I knew nothing about, accounts they'd already identified and were planning to drain the moment I was declared incompetent. Discussion of nursing homes, cheap ones, where they could warehouse me while selling my house. Discussion of cutting off all contact once the money was secured. We can just tell people she got dementia, Patricia said. No one will question why we don't visit. But what truly devastated me was the ledger Robert had created, meticulously documenting every dollar they'd taken, every forged signature, every fraudulent transfer. My husband had spent his dying months trying to save me from our own children, and he died before he could finish the job. The weight of that love, that protection, crushed me there on the garage floor. I stayed in that garage all night, the concrete floor cold beneath me, my body numb but my mind finally, crystallinely clear. Robert had given me a weapon. The question was what to do with it. I could go to the police, to lawyers, start a legal battle I couldn't afford against children with unlimited resources and no scruples about lying on oath. Or I could do something Robert would have hated but I was bitter enough to relish. I could destroy them publicly, spectacularly, irreversibly. I could take the very love of appearances and status they traded me for and immolate it at the altar of their own greed. A plan began forming, terrible and perfect in its symmetry. If you are enjoying this real story, click subscribe and tell me in the comments which part dropped your jaw so far. Oh, and don't forget to become a channel member to access exclusive videos of real stories I don't post on the main channel. Michael's wedding was in 3 months. His second wedding, actually, he divorced his first wife years ago, but Vanessa was his prize, his trophy, his proof that he'd made it. Vanessa came from old money, the kind of family that appeared in society pages and sat on charity boards. Their wedding was going to be the event of the season, 500 guests, Michelin-starred catering, coverage in luxury wedding magazines. I received an invitation, which surprised me until I realized it was for appearances. They couldn't not invite me without people asking uncomfortable questions. The invitation was beautiful, heavy cardstock with gold embossing. It had been hand-delivered by a courier because they couldn't be bothered to mail it themselves or, God forbid, deliver it in person. No one expected me to actually attend. The invitation might as well have said, please feel obligated to send a gift but don't actually show up and embarrass us with your poverty. But I RSVP'd yes. I called the number on the invitation and told whoever answered, some wedding coordinator getting paid more than I'd lived on all year, that Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell would be delighted to attend her son's wedding. The coordinator sounded confused, checking some list. I'll make a note, she said carefully. I imagined her calling Michael, your mother says she's coming. I imagined his panic, his calculation, his ultimate decision that it was too awkward to uninvite me, that he'd just sit me in the back and hope I left early. The next 3 months were dedicated to preparation. I wasn't just attending a wedding, I was preparing for war. I spent days in the library, using their computers to make copies of every document Robert had left me, every recording, every piece of evidence. I learned how to use video editing software to compile the most damaging recordings into one devastating timeline. I also had to solve a more practical problem, what to wear. I owned nothing appropriate for a society wedding, and I had maybe $300 to my name, money I'd carefully saved from selling aluminum cans I collected. Designer gowns were out of the question, obviously. But it didn't matter what I wore, did it? I wasn't there to fit in. I was there to detonate a bomb. In the end, I bought a simple black dress from a thrift store for $15. It was a size too large and slightly moth-eaten, but it was clean and didn't have any visible stains. I'd look exactly like what I was, a poor old woman who'd been discarded by her family. Perfect. I also made copies of everything on multiple USB drives and burned DVDs as backup. I mailed copies to myself at the library, to Susan the librarian, to 3 different safe deposit boxes I opened at different banks using the last of my money. I wasn't taking any chances. If something happened to me before the wedding, the evidence would still exist. The night before the wedding, I didn't sleep. I lay in my cold house, in the bed I'd shared with Robert for decades, and thought about what was coming. Part of me felt sick. These were my children. I'd given birth to them, nursed them, loved them with every fiber of my being. Tomorrow I would destroy them, and the destruction would be permanent and public and brutal. But then I remembered the recordings. I remembered Patricia's laugh as she discussed putting me in the cheapest nursing home she could find. I remembered Michael's cold calculation of my worth. I remembered 5 years of dumpster diving while they spent my money on cars and vacations. The sick feeling passed. What I felt instead was something Robert would have called righteous anger. The wedding was at an exclusive vineyard estate in Napa Valley, because of course it was. The venue alone probably cost more than I'd lived on in 5 years. Getting there was an ordeal. I took a bus, then another bus, then walked the last 3 miles because I couldn't afford a taxi. I arrived dirty and sweaty and limping from blisters, but I arrived. The entrance was all glass and modern architecture, designed to look effortlessly elegant while screaming money at every turn. Valets took cars that cost more than houses. Women in designer gowns air-kissed each other carefully to preserve their makeup. Men in tuxedos that fit like second skins discussed stock options and real estate portfolios. I looked like a cockroach at a butterfly convention. The wedding coordinator from my RSVP call spotted me immediately, her face flashing concern and confusion. Mrs. Mitchell, she asked carefully, like she wasn't sure I was actually who I claimed to be. "You're here?" It wasn't a question. It was an assessment, and I'd clearly failed it. "I am," I said simply. Behind her, I could see Michael talking to a cluster of groomsmen, his face arranged in the expression of relaxed confidence he'd perfected. Then he saw me. His face went white, then red, then carefully blank. He excused himself and walked over, moving fast. "Mom," he said, taking my arm in what looked like affection but felt like control, steering me away from the entrance where guests were arriving. "You came." "I didn't think." "You didn't mention." "You look." He couldn't finish any of those sentences, couldn't find words that would address my appearance without acknowledging what he'd done to me. "I wouldn't miss my son's wedding," I said pleasantly. My voice sounded strange to my ears, too calm, too normal. Underneath, I was vibrating like a plucked string. "It's beautiful here." Must have cost a fortune. The irony wasn't subtle, but Michael was too panicked to notice. Patricia appeared then, summoned by some sibling distress signal I couldn't detect. She was resplendent in a bridesmaid dress that probably cost more than my car had, her hair and makeup professionally done to seem effortlessly natural. When she saw me, her eyes widened with something between shock and horror. "Mother," she said, the word sounding like an accusation. "This is... we didn't expect. You should have called." She was doing math in her head, calculating how to handle this situation, how to minimize damage. Around us, guests were starting to notice the poorly dressed old woman, whispers beginning like fire catching. "I wanted to surprise you," I said. The USB drive in my small thrift store purse felt heavy as a grenade, which essentially it was. "It's not every day your eldest son gets married. Where should I sit?" It was a test, and we all knew it. Where would they put me? Would they hide me in the back, exclude me from family photos, pretend I wasn't there? Michael and Patricia exchanged glances, an entire conversation happening in the space between their eyes. "Front row, of course," Michael said finally, his voice too loud, too jovial. "Your mother of the groom. Let me show you." He was making the calculation, better to embrace my presence, make it seem intentional, than to create a scene by hiding me. As Michael led me through the venue, I saw James. He was standing by the bar, already drinking though the wedding hadn't started, his face puffy and red. When he saw me, something in his expression crumbled. He looked away quickly, unable to hold my gaze. Of all of them, James still had fragments of conscience rattling around inside him like shrapnel. The ceremony space was ridiculous in its opulence, thousands of white roses, crystal chandeliers hanging from trees, chairs draped in silk, a string quartet playing something classical and expensive sounding. The front row on the groom's side was filled with important-looking people who were definitely not me. Michael hesitated. "Actually, Mom," he said quietly, "these seats are reserved for Vanessa's family and some key business associates. You understand? But I've got you in a great spot just a few rows back." The mask slipped slightly, showing the truth underneath. I was an embarrassment to be managed, not a mother to be honored. "Of course," I said. "I understand perfectly." And I did. That was the thing, I finally understood everything with perfect clarity. He led me to a seat in the fourth row, on the aisle at least, next to an elderly man who introduced himself as somebody's uncle and then promptly fell asleep. The ceremony was beautiful in the way that large amounts of money can always create beauty, polished, perfect, utterly devoid of authentic feeling. Vanessa looked like a magazine cover in her designer gown. Michael looked like a cologne advertisement in his custom tuxedo. They said vows they'd probably hired someone to write, exchange rings that cost more than my house needed in repairs. I watched my son marry a woman whose family made his greed look almost quaint, and I felt nothing. That's what they'd done to me, they'd killed the part of me that could feel maternal love for them. 5 years of cruelty and neglect had burned it out completely. The woman sitting in that chair wasn't their mother anymore. She was their reckoning. The reception was in a massive tent adjacent to the ceremony space, decorated within an inch of its life with more flowers, more crystal, more evidence of obscene wealth. The tables were arranged in careful hierarchy, head table for the wedding party, nearby tables for important guests, gradually less important tables radiating outward. I found my name card at a table in the back corner, next to the bathrooms, with people I didn't know who clearly weren't important to the happy couple. Dinner was served, some kind of fusion cuisine that tried to be everything at once and succeeded only in being pretentious. I ate mechanically, not tasting anything, watching the head table where my 3 children sat laughing, drinking champagne that probably cost more per bottle than I'd spent on food in a month. They were celebrating. They thought they'd won. The speeches started after dinner. The best man, some colleague of Michael's, told sanitized stories of their college days that carefully edited out anything real. Vanessa's father, a severe man with the bearing of someone who'd never been told no in his life, gave a speech about legacy and family and joining of dynasties that sounded more like a corporate merger announcement. Then Patricia stood up to give her maid of honor speech. She was good at performing emotion, I'd give her that. Her voice caught in just the right places, tears glistened artfully in her eyes, and she told stories of their childhood that bore almost no resemblance to reality. In her version, they were a perfect family, loving and close, blessed by parents who gave them everything. Our mother taught us the value of family, Patricia said, and it took every ounce of control I had not to laugh out loud at the audacity. She showed us what it means to sacrifice for those you love, to put others first, to build a life centered on family bonds. She was rewriting history in real time, and everyone was eating it up. She didn't even look at me, sitting in the back corner, a living contradiction to every word she spoke. When she finished, everyone applauded. Michael hugged her. They posed for photos, the beautiful siblings in their beautiful clothes at their beautiful event. The moment was perfect for them, preserved in hundreds of photos that would be posted and framed and remembered. That's when I knew it was time. I stood up. My chair scraped loud against the floor, and a few people nearby glanced over. I walked toward the head table, moving through the crowd slowly because my old legs didn't move fast anymore and because I wanted to savor this moment. People parted for me, confused by this shabby old woman moving with such purpose. "Excuse me," I said when I reached the head table. My voice wasn't loud, but in the momentary lull between speeches, it carried. Michael saw me first, his expression cycling through confusion, concern, and calculation in rapid succession. "I'd like to say a few words, if I may. I am the mother of the groom, after all." The wedding coordinator rushed over, flustered, checking some list, looking between me and Michael. "That's not on the schedule," she whispered urgently. Michael stood up, moving to intercept me, to steer me away, to contain the situation. But we were already the center of attention. Everyone was watching. Refusing me now would look suspicious, cruel even. "Of course, Mom," Michael said through a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'd love to hear from you." It was brilliantly done, making it seem like this was planned, like he was a loving son honoring his mother. He had no idea what was coming. None of them did. Someone handed me a microphone. It felt heavy in my hand, powerful. I looked out at 500 faces, all turned toward me expectantly. The string quartet had stopped playing. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. I'd lived in silence for 5 years. Now I would be heard. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate Michael and Vanessa," I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "It's beautiful, isn't it? This venue, this celebration, this display. I've been thinking about what it cost, actually. I'm good at calculating cost now. I've had to be." Confused looks from the audience. A whisper starting. Michael's face beginning to show concern. "I've spent the last 5 years surviving on less than $500 a month while my children spent my late husband's money, my money, on houses and cars and businesses and celebrations exactly like this one. Almost $2 million. Gone. Stolen. While I ate from dumpsters." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop in that massive tent. Every eye was on me, then shifting to Michael, Patricia, James. Michael's face had gone from pink to white to gray. Patricia's hand covered her mouth. James was staring at his plate like it might offer him an escape route. I was confused for a long time. I continued, my voice stronger now, amplified by righteous anger. I thought maybe I'd misunderstood, maybe there were debts I didn't know about. But then I found something interesting. My late husband, Robert, the man you all claim to respect, whose memory Michael invoked in his vows tonight, left me evidence. Recordings. Documents. A complete accounting of how his children planned to rob me blind. Michael found his voice. Mom, you're confused. You're having an episode. Let's get you somewhere quiet. He moved toward me, hands out placating, playing to the audience like I was a senile old woman having a breakdown. But I had the microphone and I wasn't done. I have recordings of you three discussing how to declare me mentally incompetent, I said, speaking faster now before they could stop me. Planning which cheap nursing home to dump me in. Laughing about how I wouldn't notice the money was gone. Discussing offshore accounts you thought I didn't know about. Every word. Every plan. Every piece of your conspiracy. Patricia was crying now, real tears this time, but not of guilt, of rage and fear. James had his head in his hands. Around the tent, the whispers had become a roar. Phones were coming out. People were recording. This wasn't just a family drama anymore, it was going to be a scandal. The USB drives with all the evidence have been given to multiple lawyers, sent to the media, filed with the police, I continued. My voice didn't shake. This was the moment I'd lived for through 5 years of hell. You'll be arrested. You'll be sued. Everything you built on my bones will crumble. And everyone will know what you are. I set the microphone down on the head table. It landed with a thud. In the absolute silence, I looked at each of my children in turn. Michael's face was a mask of impotent rage. Patricia looked destroyed, her perfect makeup running. James just looked small, defeated, like some part of him had been waiting for this moment. You can keep the money, I said quietly, just to them. I don't want it anymore. But I wanted you to know that I know. I wanted everyone to know. I wanted to destroy this perfect moment, this celebration built on my suffering. I wanted you to feel a fraction of what you made me feel. Then I turned and walked out. My legs shook but I kept moving, through the stunned crowd, past the wedding coordinator frozen in horror, out into the cool evening air. Behind me, chaos erupted, shouts, the clatter of chairs, Vanessa's voice raised in fury, Michael trying to explain, trying to salvage something from the wreckage. I didn't look back. I walked down the long driveway, away from the lights and music and the destruction I'd unleashed. My cheap shoes pinched my feet but I barely felt it. What I felt instead was something I hadn't felt in 5 years, powerful. Visible. Heard. The weight I'd been carrying for so long had lifted, and I could finally breathe. The walk back to the main road took an hour. By the time I reached the bus stop, my feet were bleeding and my body ached in ways that reminded me sharply of my 72 years. But I sat on that bench under the flickering streetlight and I smiled. Behind me, in that vineyard estate, my children's perfect world was imploding, and I had done that. The legal consequences came swiftly, just as I'd planned. The recordings and documents I'd provided to 3 different law firms were damning beyond anything they could explain away or settle quietly. Within a week, all 3 of my children were arrested for elder financial abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. The story made national news. Wealthy siblings rob elderly mother, force her into poverty while spending millions. Michael lost his job immediately. The company couldn't afford the association with elder abuse, not in the age of social media where everything spreads like wildfire. Vanessa filed for annulment within days, her family's lawyers moving with the efficiency that old money provides when it wants to distance itself from scandal. His Malibu beach house went on the market, though no one was buying property from someone facing federal charges. Patricia's lifestyle blog and wellness business collapsed overnight. Brands pulled sponsorships, followers abandoned her in droves, and her carefully curated influencer image was replaced by screenshots of the recordings where she'd laughed about putting me in a cheap nursing home. Her Instagram became a memorial to hubris, comment sections filled with people calling her monster, devil, disgrace. She tried to delete everything but the internet is forever, and people had saved it all. James, surprisingly, was the one who broke first. 2 weeks after the wedding, his lawyer contacted mine. Yes, I finally had lawyers, 3 of them working pro bono for the publicity and because even lawyers have mothers, with a confession. James turned state evidence against his siblings, providing additional documentation of their schemes in exchange for a reduced sentence. The drugs and gambling had made him desperate, but they'd also made him weak, and weakness can look like conscience under the right circumstances. The trial took 8 months. I sat in that courtroom every single day, in the front row where they couldn't avoid seeing me. I wore the same simple dresses I'd worn during my poverty, refusing to dress up, wanting the jury to see exactly who I was and what had been done to me. Michael and Patricia sat at the defense table in expensive suits their lawyers bought them, trying to look respectable, trying to seem like victims of a misunderstanding. But the evidence was insurmountable. The recordings played in open court, my children's voices echoing through the chamber as they plotted against me. She's too old to notice. We'll declare her incompetent if we have to. Who's going to believe her over us? Every word damned them further. The prosecutor, a woman in her 50s who told me privately that this case reminded her why she'd gone into law, was merciless. She walked the jury through every stolen dollar, every forged signature, every deliberate act of cruelty. She showed them photos of me dumpster diving, taken by a private investigator I'd hired with borrowed money months before the wedding. She showed them the ledger Robert had created, his careful documentation of his children's betrayal. Eleanor Mitchell spent 5 years living in poverty, eating from trash cans, sleeping in a house with no heat, while her children spent almost $2 million of her money, the prosecutor said in her closing argument. They didn't just steal her money. They stole her dignity, her security, her final years of life. They looked at their elderly mother and saw only an obstacle to wealth, a problem to be managed and eventually eliminated. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Michael got 7 years in federal prison and was ordered to repay $800,000. Patricia got 6 years and $600,000 in restitution. James, because of his cooperation, got 3 years and $400,000. They would never repay even a fraction of what they owed. Most of the money was already spent or hidden in ways that would take years to untangle. But I didn't want the money anymore, not really. What I wanted was vindication, and I got it. I wanted them to face consequences for what they'd done, and they did. I wanted the world to know what they were, and now everyone did. Their names became synonymous with elder abuse, cautionary tales used in law schools and ethics classes. The most satisfying moment came during sentencing, when the judge addressed them directly. She was an older woman herself, maybe in her 60s, with still gray hair and eyes that had seen every kind of human cruelty. She looked at my children with undisguised contempt. In my 30 years on the bench, I have never seen a more callous, calculated betrayal of parental trust, she said. You didn't steal from a stranger. You tortured your own mother. You took the woman who gave you life and reduced her to scavenging for survival so you could buy luxury cars and vacation homes. There is a special kind of evil in that, and I hope you spend every day of your incarceration thinking about what you've become. Michael's face remained blank, prideful even in defeat, still unable to admit what he'd done. Patricia sobbed, but her tears meant nothing to me anymore. She'd cried so many times before, manipulative tears designed to get what she wanted. Only James looked at me, really looked at me, and mouthed 2 words, I'm sorry. Too little, too late, but at least it was something. After the sentencing, reporters swarmed me outside the courthouse. Microphones and cameras pressed close, voices shouting questions. How do you feel? Will you forgive them? What will you do now? I'd prepared a statement, worked on it with my lawyers, but standing there I abandoned it. I'm 72 years old, I said simply. I spent 5 years in hell because my children valued money more than they valued me. I don't know if I'll forgive them. I don't know if forgiveness is even possible for something like this. But I know they'll never hurt me again, and they'll never hurt another elderly parent the same way. That's enough. The settlement from the civil suit, separate from the criminal case, provided some financial recovery. The house was officially returned to my name, though that had never really been in question. Some of the stolen money was recovered from accounts that hadn't been completely drained. It totaled maybe $300,000, a fraction of what was taken but enough to live on comfortably for my remaining years. I used some of it to repair the house, to fix the roof and the furnace, to make it warm and safe again. I hired people to paint the walls, refinish the floors, bring life back to rooms that had been slowly dying. The house would never be what it was when Robert was alive, but it became livable again, comfortable again. A place to live rather than just survive. The rest I put in trust with independent managers, people who had no relationship to my family and no incentive to steal. I'd learned my lesson about trust, about giving people control over your life. I would never be that vulnerable again. Every statement, every transaction, I reviewed personally. I'd become vigilant in a way I never was before, and there was a sadness in that, the death of innocence, even at 72. Susan, the librarian who'd helped me through those dark years, became something like a friend. We had coffee sometimes, talked about books and nothing important. She never asked about the trial or my children unless I brought it up, which I rarely did. She just treated me like a person, which was more valuable than she knew. I also started volunteering at a legal aid clinic that specialized in elder abuse cases. There were so many stories like mine, older people being robbed and manipulated by family members, caregivers, strangers. I helped them navigate the system, shared my experience, offered what comfort I could. If my suffering could help prevent someone else's, then maybe it meant something. The nightmares came in the first year after the trial. I dreamed I was back in the dumpster, reaching for food, and my children would appear laughing. I dreamed of the wedding, but this time no one listened when I spoke, the microphone not working, my voice lost. I dream of Robert, disappointed in me for destroying our family, even though I knew intellectually he'd wanted me to fight back. Therapy helped, though it felt strange starting therapy at 72, like I should have had my life figured out by now. But trauma doesn't respect age, and betrayal hurts the same whether you're 20 or 70. My therapist, a patient woman named Dia Martinez, helped me understand that grieving my children was a process, that they died in a way even though they still physically existed somewhere in federal prison. You're mourning who you thought they were, she explained in one session. The children you raised, who you believed you knew. Those people never really existed, or maybe they existed once and disappeared somewhere along the way. Either way, you've lost them, and that loss deserves grief. She was right, though accepting it took time. I didn't visit them in prison. They wrote me letters sometimes, Michael's full of justifications and blame-shifting, Patricia's melodramatic and self-pitying, James's genuinely remorseful but too late. I read them once each and then burned them in my fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken. Their words had no power over me anymore. The grandchildren were a harder situation. 7 kids who I'd barely known, who'd been taught that Grandma Eleanor was crazy or forgetful or not worth visiting. Some of them reached out after the trial, curious, confused, looking for explanations their parents couldn't provide. I met with a few of them, tried to explain without poisoning them against their parents more than circumstances already had. My oldest grandchild, Michael's daughter Sarah, was 23 and devastated by what her father had done. She came to see me 6 months after the trial, crying in my living room, asking how she was supposed to reconcile the father she'd known with the monster the trial revealed. I had no good answers for her. People are complicated, I told her finally. Your father wasn't always what he became. Greed changes people, makes them unrecognizable even to themselves. You're not him. You're not responsible for his choices. But you do have to decide who you want to be knowing what he did. She still visits sometimes, trying to build a relationship with me that her father destroyed. It's awkward and painful and better than nothing. 3 years after the trial, I was invited to speak at a conference on elder abuse. Standing at that podium, looking out at social workers and lawyers and advocates, I felt Robert's presence like he was standing beside me. This was what he'd wanted, for the evidence he'd gathered to mean something, to protect not just me but others. Elder abuse is invisible because we make it invisible, I told them. We don't want to believe that children betray parents, that families hurt their own vulnerable members. But it happens every day. It happened to me. I was educated, aware, careful, and I still ended up eating from dumpsters while my children spent my money. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. The speech was recorded and went viral online, shared across social media with headlines like "Elderly Woman's Powerful Message About Family Betrayal" and "This Mother's Story About Elder Abuse Will Break Your Heart." I became, in a strange way, famous, not the fame my children had chased through wealth and status, but fame as a cautionary tale, a warning, a survivor. People recognized me sometimes, in grocery stores or at the library. They'd approach carefully, tell me their own stories of family betrayal or elderly relatives being exploited. Some thanked me for speaking up, for making it less shameful to admit what was happening. Some just wanted to hug me, to physically express the empathy they felt. I accepted these gestures awkwardly, still not comfortable with attention after a lifetime of invisibility. The question I get asked most often is whether I regret it, the public destruction at the wedding, the trial, the permanent severing of family ties. People want me to say yes, I think, want some message of reconciliation and forgiveness that makes the story more comfortable. But I won't lie to make others comfortable. I don't regret it, I tell them honestly. They destroyed me first, slowly, deliberately, over 5 years. They robbed me of security and dignity and my final years of peace. What I did at that wedding wasn't revenge, it was justice. It was refusing to be silent about my own abuse. It was choosing myself over their comfort for the first time in my life. Some people are disappointed by that answer. They want the narrative of the forgiving mother, the woman who rises above and offers grace even to those who don't deserve it. But I'm not that person. Maybe I'm too old to perform that kind of martyrdom, or maybe I'm just too tired. The truth is I don't forgive them, and I might never forgive them, and I'm at peace with that. 5 years after the wedding, 10 years after Robert died, I sit in my warm house, eating food I bought at a grocery store like a normal person, and I think about the life I've lived. 77 years old now, my body slower and more painful than before, but my mind clear and my conscience clean. I survived. More than survived, I fought back. The house is quiet most of the time. No grandchildren running through anymore, no family dinners, no holiday gatherings. Just me and the memories of when this place was full of life, back before I knew what my children would become. Sometimes the silence is peaceful. Sometimes it's oppressive. But it's mine. No one is stealing from me, lying to me, plotting against me. The loneliness is honest, and there's comfort in that. I think about Robert often, wonder what he'd think of how everything turned out. He hated confrontation, avoided conflict whenever possible. But he'd also spent his last months gathering evidence to protect me, so he'd understood that sometimes you have to fight. I like to think he'd be proud that I used his gift, that I didn't let our children destroy me completely. Do you think I went too far in destroying my family financially and publicly? If you discovered that the people who raised you actually despised you all along, could you forgive them, or would revenge feel inevitable? Have you ever experienced something similar with people you loved, where money poisoned everything until love died? If you enjoyed this real story, we have so much more incredible content for you. Here on the channel, you'll find real stories of elderly women who overcame everything, real emotional stories that will make you cry, real revenge stories that will drop your jaw, real life stories that inspire, real impactful stories that mark you, real impressive stories of overcoming, real stories of family betrayal, real stories of elderly people who got revenge, real touching stories about family, real inspiring stories of mature women, real stories of abandonment and revenge, real moving stories, real dramatic stories, real surprising stories, real true stories that actually happened, real strong stories about money and family, real shocking stories of inheritance, real incredible stories of justice, real emotional stories of elderly women, real Brazilian stories, real motivational stories, real stories of real people just like you. Subscribe now to the channel and click on one of the videos appearing on your screen to watch more real stories that will move you, make you reflect, and surprise you. Don't miss these extraordinary real stories.